Hello and welcome. My name is Marty Walls, and I have the honor of serving as the Interim Executive Director of the Congregational Library and Archives, the host of today's lecture. I want to give special thanks to the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, the co-sponsor of this event. The Congregational Library and Archives is a specialty library located in Boston. While we were founded over 169 years ago, we are very much a 21st century organization, as evidenced by the recent launch of our digital archives. We're going to continue to add documents to this digital archive over time, making more and more of our collections freely accessible to everyone on the internet. I invite you to explore those documents as well as our digital exhibit, which is about congregational church discipline and how it functioned to build community. I also invite you to visit the library and use our extraordinary collections for your research. We have a beautiful reading room, and we would be absolutely delighted to welcome you. It is now my pleasure to introduce Charles Hamford Stowe, the former chair of the Congregational Library and Archives Board of Directors. A retired minister, Charlie is the author or editor of 6 books and numerous articles in the field of American religious history. His books include The Practice of Piety, Puritan Devotional Disciplines in 17th Century New England, and a biography of Charles Finney.
What a privilege it is to introduce one of America's most acclaimed living authors, novelist and essayist Marilynne Robinson. A professor of English and creative writing at the University of Iowa since 1991, she has influenced multitudes through the Iowa Writers' Workshop and at other institutions of higher learning. Among the many awards honoring her work are the Pulitzer Prize and the Library of Congress Prize for American Fiction, along with honorary degrees from numerous colleges and universities. Her personal and intellectual friendship with President Barack Obama, who bestowed upon her the National Humanities Medal, is especially noteworthy. Marilynne Robinson was originally scheduled to speak 2 years ago during the Congregational Library's observance of our 400th anniversary of the 1620 Plymouth landing. But of course, that event, like so many others, was postponed and eventually was canceled due to the pandemic. We're grateful now to welcome her in this online format. The 4 novels in the Gilead cycle hit home in a myriad of ways, but I was struck by a passage in Gilead, published in 2004, when I reread it during COVID. Pastor Ames writes to his young son, "People don't talk much now about the Spanish influenza, but that was a terrible thing, and it struck just at the time of the Great War, one funeral after another, right here in Iowa. People came to church wearing masks, if they came at all. They'd sit as far from each other as they could. There was talk that the Germans had caused it with some sort of secret weapon, and I think people wanted to believe that because it saved them from reflecting on what other meaning it might have. So if it's not the Spanish or the Germans, it's got to be the Chinese." Robinson's great work, however, is precisely what she has Ames affirm: profound reflection on what other meaning things might have in light of personal faith, Christian theology, and historical study, with a perspective that is at once earnestly rooted in the American experience and prophetically against the grain of contemporary American culture, academically, politically, you name it. Of importance for us at the Congregational Library and Archives, in many essays, Dr. Robinson addresses the fact that our particular tradition, from the Puritans on, is so badly misconstrued, misused, I'll say abused, by those on both the left and the right ideologically. Blaming the Puritans, she writes in one essay, is a cultural tick, mindless, yet full of consequence. And elsewhere, why does it matter whether or not this past is remembered. I'll put the question another way. What was lost when this past was forgotten? We are grateful for Marilynne Robinson, a significant colleague in the essential work of critical-minded, faithful remembering. She speaks to us today on the topic, Hugh Peters and the Godly Commonwealth. Dr. Robinson.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to speak about the American Puritans. After years of reading related history, then reading the Puritans themselves, I am persuaded that American history could be seen in a radically new light, that it could undergo a documentable, historically scrupulous appraisal that would cause us to consider many things. I have a habit of assertiveness that I will try to suppress a little in deference to the fact that this audience includes real specialists in an area I have approached obliquely. First, in an attempt to contextualize the burst of very great literature that came out of New England in the 19th century, then in an attempt to understand the audience for which Shakespeare wrote. Those crowds of groundlings who have provided employment for future armies of college professors and journal editors by standing through performances of Hamlet and Lear. In both cases, the context can be called Puritanism, for obvious reasons in Massachusetts, in pre-revolutionary London, because the great political and religious controversies of the time were carried on in the sermons and pamphlets of dissenters and nonconformists, addressed to whomever could be reached and persuaded in a public that had become increasingly literate. Shakespeare's histories dramatized Hall, Holinshed, Fox, and other writers who addressed popular interest in the dynastic wars that lay behind the Tudor and Stuart regimes. I would be happy to defend the thesis that in his treatment of this disastrous period, Shakespeare posed a crucial question, whether hereditary monarchy can in practice produce legitimate government or fit and capable rulers. His conclusion, I would argue, was that it could not. The crisis England was approaching had everything to do with the legitimacy of monarchy itself. Persecutions under Mary I had sent leading dissenters to Geneva, where hereditary rulers had been expelled and the city governed as a republic since 1541. The Dutch had defeated Philip II and formed a republic in 1581 with the help of Englishmen, notably Sir Philip Sidney, who were sympathetic with the Dutch as fellow Calvinists. In other words, despite all E.M.W. Tilliard wrote on the subject, it is nonsense to suggest that Shakespeare could think only in terms of hierarchies and chains of being. This is all well known to students of the Reformation. Nevertheless, that nautical England, already strenuously involved in the world, would have no awareness of events on the continent and of the ideas behind those events is actually a basic assumption behind many interpretations of Elizabethan writers, notably Shakespeare. History has become so segmented that, for example, the English Renaissance and Reformation are treated as separate and discrete phenomena, even contrarieties, though they were perfectly simultaneous, and many writers and political figures were important to both. This is almost as great a mystery as the total disappearance of the Puritan Revolution in England as an important event in early American history, even as an event contemporary with early settlement, putting aside its crucial significance for our early history. The central figure in what I will say is a man named Hugh Peters, a minister who served the church in Salem, Massachusetts for 6 years, 1635 to 1641. With some exceptions, John Winthrop, for example, The importance of Puritan figures in early America is inversely proportionate to the attention they receive from historians and the degree to which their names are known to the general public, or for that matter, to those same historians. Francis Bremer has called John Winthrop a forgotten founding father, quite appropriately. Massachusetts, New England, and America have a great many forgotten founders, unacknowledged leaders who established ideals of civic life that ultimately formed the system we have called American democracy. I choose to speak about Hugh Peters because he is so utterly forgotten, and because things were true of him that were widely characteristic of Puritans in the early colonial period. He was well educated, a Cambridge graduate. He had traveled very widely in Europe, having served an English church in Rotterdam before coming to Massachusetts. He enjoyed standing among his international peers, reflected in his having had conversation with Gustavus Adolphus, the mighty king of Sweden, and he was a kinsman of John Winthrop. There is no other word in English as effectively dismissive as Puritan. Americans, even or especially historians, tend to treat the early New Englanders as dogmatists, as narrow, pious simpletons, more or less, as if Massachusetts were Pitcairn Island. That their region and culture became a profoundly influential force in this civilization and in the modern world is for all purposes unacknowledged and unaddressed, except in allusion to Max Weber, whose bad little book does not deal with either America or Puritanism. Because of Weber, perhaps, the successes adumbrated in Winthrop's phrase, "a city on a hill," seem always to be associated with wealth and power, not with the stratum of communal or political life that touches on justice and, yes, liberty. These elements in our history seem to be increasingly confounded by the power of a cynicism brought on by the belief that wealth and power were all it was ever about. The word Puritan brackets a crucial culture and period with a peculiar prejudice, the notion that it was ridiculous in its pretensions and in its provincialism. I may seem to overstate. There have been specialists in the field, certainly, but the work of these writers often illustrates and compounds the suppression or occlusion of this history. An entrenched habit of what must be called piety in the treatment of England by American historians obscures the context within which their determined nonconformity might be understood. I learned by pure accident that a code of law was drawn up in Massachusetts in 1641 that substantially anticipates the American Bill of Rights. For no reason, 50 years ago by now, I happened to read a letter to the editor in the New York Times in which the Massachusetts body of liberties was mentioned. I had a PhD by then. I was supposedly an Americanist by training, and yet I was learning of this for the first time. When I found and read these laws, I could only wonder why the narrative of American history does not begin with them. They have remained the basis of the legal system of Massachusetts, which indicates that they were not simply an early burst of utopianism, but instead an expression of an enduring political philosophy. With all respect to Thomas Jefferson, I know of no reason to doubt that he read them too. How else would lawyers prepare for drafting laws appropriate to a new country, other than by looking at the systems the various colonies had proposed for themselves? John Adams of Massachusetts played a dominant part in the convention that drafted the Declaration of Independence. In the Declaration, the English king is charged with suppressing the work of colonial assemblies, which would certainly have made their work of great interest to those gentlemen revolutionaries, members of the political class whose intentions the king had scotched. I will return to the body of liberties, which deserves much more attention than I will be able to give it here, and to Hugh Peters, who had a hand in the writing of it. The attempt to retrieve the particulars of a life slighted by history is much complicated by the prejudices that suppressed it in the first place. While it is probable that Peters' influence would have been strongly felt in these laws, it is also important that the liberties reflect a consensus, also reflected in the Mayflower Compact, presumably, and urged on the colonists by Winthrop as Christian charity. The code was ratified by the colony's assembly. If Hugh Peters is so little noted by history, how can the case be made that he was indeed an important figure? A few unambiguous facts can be adduced. For years, he was chaplain to Oliver Cromwell and to the British Parliament. He left Salem for England in 1641 on business for the colony, was caught up in the events of the emerging revolution there, stayed and served the Puritan or parliamentary side practically and spiritually until the revolution failed. That his importance to Cromwell was real is demonstrated in his having endured the ingeniously horrible and protracted punishment of half-hanging, burning, and dismemberment reserved for traitors and Jesuits, having been forced to watch his best friend suffer the same death a day earlier. This, of course, was at the Restoration. He was and is accused of being a regicide, even of wielding the axe that killed Charles I, though there is no evidence for this. That he did help to create the circumstances that led to the king's death is harder to dismiss. English history is full of sad stories of the deaths of kings with their allies and kin. This is not whataboutism. It is simply a nod to the fact that executions had been central to regime change or consolidation for centuries, whatever anyone might say about the sanctity that hedges in a king. Charles' trial in Parliament was the true innovation in all this. Due process, a jury of one's peers, were not rights extended to Due process, a jury of one's peers, were not rights extended to doomed royalty. More than a century later, the French Revolution followed this precedent, trying Louis XVI as citizen Louis Capet. For the purpose of his trial, the English king had been Mr. Charles Stuart. The revolutions differ greatly in the fact that the execution of Charles did not set off a violent purge of his family or supporters. The huge convulsion called the English Civil Wars, or the Puritan Revolution, which took place during the early settlement of British North America, affected profoundly both the composition of the early colonial populations, North and South, and the laws, English and American, that shaped and governed them. These wars are themselves a resounding silence in American history. Granting always that there are specialists in this area of study, their work has no influence on public or non-specialist awareness of these decisive facts and events. The word Puritan smothers what might otherwise be a natural interest in colonial New England, the most progressive society in the world in its time. The word makes of the Cromwell period a dull tale of oppression, a historical dead end. I will suggest that Puritan America had this singular character of radical liberality because the Puritan colonies were revolutionary from their founding, created by the disruptions of the English wars and by the interregnum or Commonwealth, the decades during which they were left to themselves by a government that was preoccupied with its own crises and that would have been sympathetic with their aspirations in any case. The prominence of Hugh Peters in Massachusetts and then in Cromwell's England suggests a relationship between the two Englands, in a phrase of the time, that was much more interesting than mere consanguinity. The body of liberties of 1641 obviously did not rise organically from a society based largely in subsistence farming, with English common law as its default. Its concerns are broader than a brief experience of life in the New World could have occasioned. It has the character of a constitution in that it defines the relationship of the individual to the political state. It takes its authority not from a royal assent or some Commonwealth equivalent, but from its ratification by the colonial assembly and its indebtedness to biblical law. John Winthrop's famous address assumes that what happens in Massachusetts will be of interest to the world, at worst a significant and conspicuous failure. The phenomenon of colonization was widespread in the world at the time, an important part of Europe's emerging commercial and industrial systems. These plantations sometimes were havens for dissenters and often places of exile for undesirables, the labor of slaves making it all viable and profitable. In other words, colonies were not the kind of project on which people placed exalted hope, nor were they allowed the kind of latitude that could make them experiments in varieties of social order. Two sets of laws with the king's imprimatur, intended for the government of Carolina and Virginia, made clear that the often invoked liberties of Englishmen were by no means extended to English colonials in principle or in fact. The year 1641 saw Parliament at full-scale war with the king. Assuming that the Massachusetts colonists were aware of what had been happening in the homeland, aware of the protracted crisis of government that had raised profound questions about the nature and limits of royal power, we may also assume that they were not simply proceeding from a British model in arriving at their body of liberties. Simply publishing laws written in the English language was in itself a great departure from precedent and a redefinition of the origins and character of civil authority. The British Petition of Right of 1628, drawn up by the House of Commons and submitted to the king in the year before he dissolved Parliament and took all power into his own hands, was a part of this struggle, invoking Magna Carta to forbid taxation not agreed to by Parliament, as well as imprisonment and execution without due legal process. In other words, it was addressed to specific abuses of law and custom engaged in by Charles I. The question behind these codes of law is, what will the new world be? The body of Liberties is meant to answer this question. Quote, "We do therefore this day religiously and unanimously decree and confirm these following rights, liberties, and privileges concerning our churches and civil state to be respectively, impartially, and inviolably enjoyed and observed throughout our jurisdiction forever." The fundamental constitutions of the Carolinas of 1669, after the fall of the Cromwell regime, was written by or attributed to John Locke and assented to by the king. It is a design for a perfect feudalism, social rank and authority corresponding exactly in perpetuity to the amount of land held by individuals. This would be determined in the first place by original grants, presumably, since land was to be unalienable, never to be bought or sold. Thus, the social order would be permanently fixed. The landless, called leetmen, were to be leetmen through all generations, unable to leave the estate of their lord without his permission, having no appeal against his judgments. Since the colonies were agricultural, these leetmen, dealt with so curtly by the law, would be by far the largest share of the population. One last category of person is dealt with in even fewer words. The law specifies that the authority of any white man over his African slave shall be absolute. All this is as remote from the traditions of quote unquote English liberty as could well be imagined, even granting the great importance of hereditary land ownership in the British system and the primacy of property in British law. This constitution is indeed fundamental, as if prior to every moderating concession sought or won from King John or King Charles, the invented names of its castes, highest landgraves, under them caciques and so on, uproots them from the system of traditional privileges associated with the ranks of British society. The degree to which the king felt beholden to custom or to Magna Carta, or felt the claims of any liberties inhering in his subjects, is thrown into question by this design for the society and government of the colonial South, the Carolinas being at the time a region extending from Virginia to the border of Florida. An earlier code called Dale's Laws, written in England, written in England to govern a colony in Virginia, was lengthy and furiously repressive, calling for whippings and death for infractions of all kinds, death for missing church 3 times, death for speaking ill of the king. It is always hard to know how strictly any laws are enforced, but these severities loomed over the life of the colony for nearly a decade. These laws, enacted under James I and invoking his authority, make the point in less decorous terms that no rights protected anyone to whom the laws applied. These were not slaves in the usual sense, at least, nor were they convicts, granting that colonists were generally not the cream of society. But they were British subjects exposed to the harshest penalties for minor infractions. There is no mention of trial or appeal. My point is to draw attention to the great difference between the laws made by the Puritan colonists in this period and those devised and approved in London. The severity of the English laws in matters of religion has no equivalent at all in the Massachusetts body of liberties. The lens of history inverts. The Puritans are remembered, so to speak, for harsh dogmatism, but it is the Church of England to which these Virginians must go on pain of death. These bodies of law demonstrate in their various ways that the New World might as well have been another planet, where old rules, such as they were, would not apply. The laws for Virginia and the Carolinas swept away the impediments to authority represented in the claims of traditional rights. The body of liberties, from the title onward, is an assertion of these and other rights based largely on biblical law, a profounder source than lex terrae, which was a fairly elusive standard at best, clearly not acknowledged in the laws of this alien land. So in 1641, when co-religionists were claiming power in England, Massachusetts set about creating a legal framework for itself based on the consent of the governed. The body of liberties acknowledges no other interest in the nature of the government than the colony itself. The very humane character of these laws, especially given the standards of the time, is generally seen as reflecting its heritage in English common law. I will pause here to ask a question. Where do I look to find this important heritage recorded, defined, and explicated? The 1911 Encyclopedia Britannica gives the subject short shrift. Common law is simply regional practice in various parts of the country. No case law is offered, no general principles. Compare the Britannica's article on poor law, still in force at that writing, painstakingly described over a number of pages, and compare this important system for regulating the lives of workers, another name for the poor, with any idea you might have of the civil protections of common law. My point here is simply that the aspirations expressed in humane law should not be referred to a rightfulness already achieved in certain quarters and sustained by them unreflectingly as a kind of second nature. The objections made to royal policies and the petition of rights are said to have influenced articles of the American Constitution. Similarities between the two documents could as well reflect the experience of their writers with abuses of power that were persisted in during the 150 years that intervened between the writing of them. I may seem to digress, but in fact, I hope to anticipate the minimizing of the meaning of the creation of the body of liberties, the subsuming of this achievement under the category of common law, with the implication that there was no essential breach involved, that the colonists were simply groping toward a kind of maturity long enjoyed in the mother country. This is a common basis for the idea that the American Revolution was unjustified, unnecessary. At a time when the very legitimacy of monarchy was being challenged, it is appropriate to assume that new thinking was being done in America, as in revolutionary England, for example, in the orderly debates held on these subjects within Cromwell's army. Massachusetts was the product and offshoot of the Puritan Revolution, the Commonwealth writ small. Its characterizing institutions were churches whose polity was radically democratic, autonomous, self-governing congregations who elected their clergy and could send them away. Christendom had sanctified hierarchy in its church order for centuries. The Puritan church sanctified its absence. The difference between the colonial law and British law is made very clear in the prohibition on one hand of, quote, bodily punishments that are inhumane, barbarous, or cruel, the Massachusetts law, and on the other hand, the death that would be suffered by Peters and others. The prohibition against delayed burial of an executed man stands in contrast to the exhumation and abuse of the body of Oliver Cromwell and others. While British practice in both cases was extreme, in neither case was it wholly exceptional. The prohibition against extracting a confession through the use of torture might call to mind the suffering and death of the young Protestant martyr Anne Askew, who was famous and exceptional in that she was a gentlewoman. That is to say that the background against which these colonial laws should be understood is not Magna Carta. Rather, they are protections against the ancient and contemporary role and use of legal process in Britain, which showed little deference to Magna Carta or to common law, to the, quote, to the degree that they are assumed to have moderated brutality. The Acts and Monuments of the Martyrs by John Fox, a massive chronicle of the persecution and suppression of religious dissent in Britain and Europe, is snickered at by historians whom I must believe have never looked at it. It is a vast trove of historic materials of great interest to Shakespeare, among others, and the prehistory and family history of Anglo-American Puritanism. It describes in the recurrence of jailing and burning of people, a pattern begun in England in the first year of Henry IV, 1400, and continuing into the Reformation. It argues that dissent was continuous with lollardy, the violent expression over 3 centuries itself proof that, pardon me, I'll read that over. It argues that dissent was continuous with lollardy, the violent repression over 3 centuries itself proof that dissent was never repressed and that it was extraordinarily determined. Fox's history certainly demonstrates that all that conflict was about much more than icons and vestments. The American colonies were aware of one another and of their various dealings with London. This would have informed them of policies that might be applied in their case as well. The body of Liberties is careful to specify that even the condemned or excommunicated are free to dispose of their property as they see fit. This might be in response to the design for the Carolinas based on unalienable land ownership and fixed class status. In any case, it removes an important traditional power of the church and the state. Any man and his family can leave a jurisdiction at will. This again might be a response to the Carolina laws, which would have restricted the movement of the lowest class of persons, increasing their dependence on the landowner. Or it might be a response to the poor laws, which required the forcible return of workers who had fallen into indigence to the parish where they were born, always their only legal residence. These laws stayed in effect in Britain into the 20th century. Their origins were in the 14th century, when freedom of movement was legally limited for workers after the Black Plague reduced their numbers to the point where they could look elsewhere for better wages. Under the Ordinance of Laborers, they were prevented from leaving their present situation, prevented from pursuing happiness, if that word is understood as well-being and its effects, The body of liberty forbids imprisonment without trial and also double jeopardy, which are certainly important. But these broader relaxations of constraints on individual choice and movement would have affected the lives of most people and would have impacted the structure of the whole society. If these laws made official the existing state of things in the colony, they are only more robust for this fact. More radical still is the plain language of the document. No man, every man. These phrases occur as insistently as on pain of death does in Dale's laws. The liberties are, for the most part, written to be universal within the community. This is most explicit when the basis of the law is scriptural. The second liberty says, every person within this jurisdiction, whether inhabitant or foreigner, shall enjoy the same justice and law that is general for the plantation, which we constitute and execute toward one another without partiality or delay. The Bible says, "Ye shall have one manner of law, as well for the stranger as for your," "Ye shall have one manner of law, as well for the stranger as for one of your own country, for I am the Lord your God." The assumptions behind both the fundamental constitution of the Carolinas and Dale's laws are obvious, though not explicit. Human beings as such have no inherent rights, no rights the state does not give them and cannot deny them. In endowing all persons with inherent right, these liberties very much diminish the authority that can be claimed by the state. Granting the strikingly enlightened character of the body of liberties, laws are said to have a spirit that governs their literal meaning. In what spirit was this code created? There are limits to what we can surmise. They were Puritan in their origins and Mosaic, even to dutifully enumerating the capital crimes found in the books of Moses, plus another one for conspiring against the colony. Should we find an effective severity or a narrowness in them? Are they capitalist, like the colonial system itself? Are they oligarchical? The biases that are brought to bear on American Puritanism would encourage us to imagine that the liberties are less than they seem. Yet it should be noted that capital offenses do not include crimes against poverty in the liberties or in Deuteronomy. Under English law, the theft of a shilling's worth was a hanging offense. The laws of Moses on this point would have spared untold thousands of lives. This is again a reform that would very much disburden the poor, the crime being so closely linked to their particular distress. To what extent should these liberties be understood in relation to transformations that were and would be their consequence? Hugh Peters, a founder of Harvard, colonial emissary to London, chaplain to Oliver Cromwell, a man who irked his enemies by telling jokes and laughing inordinately, even as he preached, in 1651 published a tract called "Good Work for a Good Magistrate, or a Shortcut to Great Quiet." It is notable in many respects, first for insight it gives into the breadth of thought possible and acceptable in Commonwealth England, second as an indication of the kind of spiritual counsel Cromwell accepted through his years in power. In his treatise, Peters does not look to English law or precedent. He says, quote, "It is very advisable to burn all the old records, yea, even those in the Tower, the monuments of tyranny." He looks instead to the example of the Dutch, another new republic. Burning the records sounds like the kind of wild antinomianism revolutions sometimes fall into, but his proposals are strikingly humane and reformist. His proposals are addressed to Parliament, which was at the time both the leading force in the revolution and the revolutionary model of legitimate government. He is speaking to his allies, insurrectionists, who are also a traditional center of authority, and he is offering them a list of reforms that would seize on the opportunities that seem available to the new order of things. His good works resemble the liberties of Massachusetts in that no deference or submission is offered, no approval is asked. As in the Liberties, the first order of business is the organization of the system of justice, following the example of Moses, perhaps. The social order of both Massachusetts and Peters reformed England, the social order of both Massachusetts and Peters reformed England would be based on a judiciary composed of persons subject to frequent elections. The full title of Peters' pamphlet is Good Work for a Good Magistrate, or A Shortcut to Great Quiet, by honest, homely, plain English hints given from scripture, reason, and experience for the regulating of most cases in this Commonwealth concerning religion, mercy, and justice. It is addressed to authorities, presumably friends in Parliament, but it also seems to be intended for a popular readership. It is notable that although the proposals Peters offers are meant to produce quiet, to promote social order in the middle of the Cromwell period, there is no hint of repression in them. Peters' proposals are all of liberalizations of existing law or practice. It might be fair to call them progressive, since some of them, if they were proposed today, would certainly be placed in that category, which is to say they would probably be dismissed. The laws promulgated for the American colonies in London indicate the great latitude the king and his agents felt they had in dealing with those subject to them in an environment similarly open to improvisation. In terms of established English law, it is notable that Peters treats poverty as a condition that should be prevented or alleviated, rather than treating the poor as a distinct class whose rights were narrowly limited by English law. This is a profound difference. He says the state should have a stock ready to protect the poor from rising prices so that the laborer may live comfortably, his language. He says care must be taken that poor men especially may not be clapped up in prison, and thereby they and their families undone in a short time because he is not able to put in bail. There are now a great many people incarcerated in America because they cannot make bail or pay some trifling fine. Peters says, quoting, "Great cruelties are committed in prisons by great charges for fees, chambers, and dear victuals, and by stinking and unwholesome rooms, all which in mercy and love to humankind ought to be prevented." End of quote. We know many of our prisons are unwholesome and in general show little love to humankind. Peters is very alert to the fact that incarceration is the special burden of the poor. He asks, and how can it be just to punish any by loathsome prisons before a hearing whether he be guilty or no? How many innocent persons have suffered this way, and how many have lost their lives by sickness got there? End of quote. How many people in Rikers Island are awaiting trial? Quote, long laying in prison before sentence or delays in justice is great cruelty to many, and it mightily provokes the Lord. As Isaiah saith, and certainly it may be remedied if there were compassion enough to prisoners. Here and throughout, Peters cites scripture in support of his reforms. That the Bible was a liberalizing influence in early modern and specifically revolutionary cultures is as far from our assumptions as that Cromwell and his parliament would engage a chaplain for years whose political views are so advanced as to embarrass us in the inconceivably wealthy and comparatively stable 21st century. It should be noted, though his proposals are justified to his readers in religious terms, they are all practicable, given only a more generous outlay of public resources and a real commitment to justice. Peters says, let no difference be made between Jews or Gentiles, bond or free, stranger or natives, in either criminal or civil things, for so hath God commanded, and by this means shall the governors be true fathers of humanity. Cromwell would begin to lift the laws that had for centuries made it illegal for Jews to live in England, as it was when Peters wrote. Under pre-Commonwealth law, laborers could be hanged for idleness. Jesuits were subject to gruesome execution, otherwise reserved for traitors. There was, on principle and in practice, severe inequality before the law. Peters understands that the problem of inequality involves more than social rank. He says, if any lawyer be continued, let them be allowed and but paid by the state, and plead for justice even for justice' sake. Why should expenses in law be thus bottomless? Yea, such as would maintain an army, and the fountain and issues thereof generally malice and rancor. Why are not the fees of physicians stinted, and then help commanded upon a known price? Why indeed? Hugh Peters, most disparaged of Puritans, wanted to exclude artists from taxation. He proposed that there be peacemakers appointed in every town to settle disputes, if possible, before anyone could be arrested or imprisoned. Writing as someone who was forced to flee England under the threat of persecution, whose fellow dissenters had had much experience of prison and worse, it is striking that he does not call for any equivalent punishment or any punishment at all for his temporarily defeated adversaries, but calls instead for an alleviation of the punitive bent in the assertion of public authority. And here is what he says about religion. None can be free of great injustice who by persecution for religion take away liberty of conscience from any, whose principles or practices are not dangerous to the government, peace, propriety, and good of the Commonwealth, if they otherwise live but civilly. For as God himself, so his vice-regent, the magistrate, must cause his sun to shine and his rain to fall, both upon good and bad. This is more or less the state of American law at present, though there are pressures now that might take it to a less enlightened place. As with Islam, at present, there were geopolitical anxieties behind the exclusion of Catholicism from the civic sun and rain. And any royalist might point out that Puritanism itself had been very dangerous to a government. Peters acknowledges that true justice is difficult to achieve, but he has mitigation for the starkness of this fact. Even in the punishment of the worst offenders, quote, may they be duly punished, rather inclining to mercy than cruelty, and always with a merciful heart. His own terrible death makes clear how great a departure this would have been from pre-existing and restoration law. These Puritan revolutions were about deeper things than we are led to suppose. Thank you.
Marilynne, on behalf of the Congregational Library and Archives and the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, thank you. That was so interesting. I'm so grateful to learn more about Hugh Peters, and the phrase that's going to stick with me the most out of all of this is radical liberality. That is a phrase that I hope all of us listening to your lecture will remember as we think about the Puritans. So thank you for sharing your wisdom and your insights. We're just so grateful to have had you with us today. Thank you so much.